beneath the blood-red canopy of an eternal dusk, in the forgotten village of Nyobala nestled between the whispering dunes of the Koro Desert and the sacred river of Bamba, a girl named Naya was born with a thin film over her eyes, a mark the elders called Age's Veil, a rare sign that meant she could see through time and dreams and be touched by the voices of ancestors. But no one celebrated her birth, for her lineage carried a dark stain her grandmother, Mama Ori, had once defied the gods and stolen youth from her own descendants using a carved ivory comb soaked in moonblood and river ash, a forbidden relic passed down through generations wrapped in banana leaves and tied with the hair of firstborn daughters, hidden in a hollowed calabash buried under the hearthstone of their crumbling hut. And though no one dared speak of the comb, everyone knew its curse walked barefoot in the women of that bloodline, aging them quickly, distorting their dreams, and dooming their loves. Naya's mother, Emem, had withered before her time. Her once glowing face turned brittle as dried yam, her voice reduced to murmurs in the wind, warning her daughter in fits of madness never to comb her hair under a full moon, or trust a man whose shadow bent against the light. But Naya, orphaned and fierce, grew up with the fire of rebellion in her spirit. Her eyes storm dark and her laughter a sound that made old women look away in silence. And when she met Duma, a stranger with scars carved like tribal riddles on his back and a smile that tasted of danger, she followed him blindly, fleeing her cursed village with only a leather bag, a faded cloth of her mother's scent, and the comb she had unearthed one stormy night, drawn to it by dreams of her grandmother whispering, "The river owes me youth. Child, bring me what was stolen." And though Naya didn't understand the meaning, she kept the comb close, believing it to be a key to unlocking her destiny, unaware that Duma, the man she fled with, was not only running from a blood feud but bore a monstrous truth in his soul, one that slumbered beneath his charm, like a serpent in dry leaves, waiting for the heat of her trust to stir it awake. For Duma was a beater of women, his rage inherited from the spirit of his mother's tormentor, a man whose bones were fed to the hyenas under the black moon. And as they crossed into the realm of Ogbun, a land where the air shimmered with spirits and every tree bore eyes, the comb began to hum faintly in Naya's satchel, pulsing like a forgotten heartbeat, as if it remembered something terrible was about to return. And the ancestors stirred in their graves, whispering warnings on the wind that neither Duma nor Naya could hear yet. The land of Ogbun was not like any place Naya had known. It breathed with old magic, the soil dark and soft like ashes of burned ancestors, and the trees spoke in creaks and hisses as if repeating forgotten names, their branches shaped like twisted hands reaching to reclaim what had been stolen by the living. And as Naya and Duma entered its edge beneath a sky draped in endless twilight, a flock of silent black egrets took flight, circling them thrice before vanishing into mist, a sign the seers would have recognized as the presence of an unburied curse walking upright. The villagers of Ogbun, gaunt and colorless like the bark of dead trees, watched them with wide eyes, their mouths stitched in fear, their silence heavy with secrets. And though Naya sensed the coldness in their gaze, she mistook it for suspicion of strangers and clutched Duma's arm tighter, comforted by his quiet strength, unaware that the very ground she walked on had swallowed women like her before, women who bore the same veil of sight, the same blood-stained legacy, the same hunger to be free of fate. But fate here was a living creature with sharp teeth, and it had already tasted her scent. That night, they slept in a hut offered by an old man who never blinked and whose shadow refused to move, even when the fire danced. And as Naya laid her head beside Duma, the comb stirred again inside her satchel, hotter now, as though it fed on the soil of this place. and her dreams split open into chaos, a river of blood where children danced backward. A voice like Mama Ori's chanting in tongues from a tree strung with bones. Duma's face dissolving into that of a beast with bleeding eyes. And then the comb floating in midair, combing itself through a mass of writhing hair that screamed with every stroke. And when she awoke gasping, sweat turning to frost on her skin despite the heat, she found Duma already outside, his back turned to her, his body tense, talking to the old man in hurried whispers, and though she couldn't hear their words, she felt the shift in the air, as if something ancient had entered her bones and refused to leave. Later, when Duma returned, he held her close, his grip firm like a warning, and whispered that they would continue east toward the sacred hills, where an old priestess could cleanse their journey. But Naya saw it then, the flicker of violence beneath his tenderness, the flash in his eyes when she hesitated, like lightning trapped behind glass. And though she nodded and smiled, her soul recoiled inwardly. For the comb now whispered during waking hours, whispering not in words but in pulses of heat and ache and vision, showing her glimpses of Duma standing over a crying woman with a stone raised high, a thread of blood unraveling from his knuckles like red string from a loom. And as they walked deeper into the forest toward the priestess, the path seemed to curve and repeat itself like time bending under a curse. And the wind began to chant again in the voice of Mama Ori, not pleading, but laughing softly, the laugh of someone who has already seen the ending and knows it cannot be escaped. The forest that led to the sacred hills grew thicker and darker as though each step peeled away time, and the trees loomed closer, their roots rising like veins through the earth, pulsing with a deep, unseen life that felt ancient and watchful. And as Naya and Duma moved forward, the path narrowed until it resembled a throat swallowing them into shadow, with branches creaking above like bones grinding in a restless sleep. And every so often Naya would glance over her shoulder, sure she heard footsteps behind them, light and barefoot, as though something was trailing their scent. And Duma, who once hummed songs to pass the time, now walked in silence, eyes darting side to side, jaw clenched, his body stiff with the weight of unseen burdens. The further they went, the heavier Naya's satchel grew, the comb now warm like skin and humming with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. And with every hour that passed, her thoughts began to slip like wet leaves, memory folding over memory, until she could not recall how many days had passed or whether the sun had risen at all. For the sky above remained a smear of bruised clouds and smoky light, and time in the forest unraveled like cloth burned from one end, each thread snapping silently into the void. They came upon a clearing where a stone totem stood 8 feet high, carved with faces that had no eyes, only mouths open in silent screams. And around its base were coils of dried hair, jewelry half buried in the soil, and a child's sandal, bleached by time. And Naya felt her chest clench as the comb in her satchel began to hum violently, as if trying to leap out. And when she touched it, a vision struck her eyes like lightning. She saw Mama Ori standing naked beneath this very totem, hair unbound, holding the comb above her head while a line of bound girls knelt before her, weeping. And in a voice that echoed from the dirt itself, she declared, "The youth of my womb shall be mine again, and the river shall remember my name." Then plunged the comb into her own scalp and drew it slowly down as the girls collapsed one by one, their youth unraveling into the ground like threads into soil. And as Naya gasped, falling to her knees, Duma rushed to her side, but his touch was different, rough, impatient, as though annoyed by her weakness. And in that moment she saw the shadow behind his shadow, a hulking shape with eyes like burning coals and fists clenched in blood. and she knew something dark lived inside him, something born not of this world, but called forth by rage and bloodline, a spirit perhaps older than him, older than her, older even than Mama Ori's crime. And she did not cry. She only looked at the totem and whispered the name she did not know she remembered. Ekongu, the devourer of daughters. And as the name left her lips, the ground beneath the totem cracked slightly, and the air turned cold as if the forest itself inhaled sharply, listening, waiting, and somewhere far off, a drum began to beat, not played by hands, but by the will of the forest itself, slow and deep, like the beating heart of a slumbering god awakening. As the beat of the forest's unseen drum echoed through the hollow-bellied trees, Naya stood slowly, her breath thick like smoke in her throat, her fingers clenched around the comb that now pulsed with such intensity it felt alive, as if it held a spirit desperate to speak but bound in silence. And the totem before her, cracked and weeping black sap from its mouth-shaped carvings, trembled faintly as though something beneath the soil was testing the strength of its prison. And Duma, standing beside her, shifted uneasily, his eyes wide but unreadable, sweat gleaming on his brow though the air had turned cold enough to freeze. Dew on bark, and Naya looked at him, really looked at the scars that once seemed to whisper stories of pain, now glistening with a strange shimmer, as if inked with ancestral blood. And in his gaze she saw not a man, but a gate, a vessel, something forged not by love or destiny but by violence carved deep into bone. And when she reached out to touch his hand, it twitched, and for the briefest moment she saw flickers visions, stitched into the spaces between their fingers of Duma as a boy, watching his mother scream beneath a man with a laugh like thunder. Then Duma as a man, recreating that scream in others' mouths with clenched fists and tearless eyes. And in every scene the same thing hovered just behind him, a black mass with a horned face and no mouth, breathing rage into his ears like a lover whispering secrets. And she gasped, pulling her hand away, heart thundering like hooves across dry earth, and the comb responded violently, a burst of heat traveling up her arm, searing her shoulder with a mark unseen. And suddenly a great wind rose around them, circling the totem, lifting leaves, dust, fragments of old bone and strands of gray hair, spinning them into a cyclone that sang in a forgotten tongue. And out of the whirlwinds stepped a figure neither fully human nor spirit, a woman robed in red earth and bone necklaces, her skin painted with ash, her eyes glowing like embers. And she spoke not to Naya, not to Duma, but to the comb itself, saying, "Child of Ori, thief of time, you are not yet forgiven." And as her voice struck the air, the wind dropped dead, the leaves fell like exhausted birds, and silence gripped the forest again. Duma staggered back, eyes wide with a fear he could not name, and Naya, trembling, asked the figure who she was. And the woman answered with a riddle. "I am the scar the river hides, the whisper beneath your name, the face of what must be paid." Then vanished like smoke into the trees, and the moment she disappeared, Naya felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and the comb vibrated once, then fell still, as if stunned by recognition, and the forest's heartbeat slowed, as though whatever had stirred had gone back to sleep for now. And Duma said nothing, only stared at the totem with clenched fists, his breath uneven. And when Naya turned to walk, she realized the forest path had changed, the trees now parting to reveal a narrow trail lined with red feathers and bones carved into charms, a path that had not been there before, leading deeper into the sacred hills where, it was said, the veil between the living and the dead grew thin enough for old truths to rise and demand justice in blood or silence. They followed the path of red feathers and bone charms in silence, each step a weight, each breath a pact unspoken, and though the trees parted to let them through, the air round them remained heavy with a presence that pressed against Naya's skin like unseen hands trying to peel back her memories. And with every feather they passed, the comb inside her satchel stirred more violently, no longer whispering impulses, but now humming a chant she could nearly hear, an old, forgotten song that spoke of rivers choked with regret and ancestors who slept with open eyes. And Duma, once confident and commanding, now lagged behind her, his face pale and jaw tight, as if the wind carried a scent that only he could recognize, a scent that reminded him of screams buried deep in his past. And Naya, though afraid, walked ahead, guided by a force she no longer questioned, as though the comb, now warm against her spine, had become a compass of blood and fire, pulling her towards something that was part of her, and yet older than time itself. The path led them to a steep slope of stone carved with spirals that seemed to move when not watched, and as they climbed, the sky above flickered from bruised dusk to an eerie violet, as though the heavens were blinking open to watch their progress. And when they reached the summit, they found themselves standing before a massive archway of living wood to towering trees entwined, like lovers frozen in an eternal embrace, their bark veined with gold that pulsed like a heartbeat, and in the space between them shimmered a curtain of mist that glowed faintly blue, like the skin of a stillborn god. There stood a guardian, not a man, not a beast, but a being cloaked in feathers of every color, its face hidden behind a mask carved from obsidian and teeth, holding a spear made of lightning bound in roots, and it did not speak, only raised its hand toward Naya, palm up, waiting, and she knew instinctively what it wanted. Though fear clawed at her throat, she reached slowly into her satchel, her fingers brushing the comb now burning hot like embered coal, and as she placed it gently into the guardian's palm, the mist between the trees flared with sudden light, then darkened to black, and in its depths emerged visions her mother crying in the hut at night, clutching a bloodied cloth, Mama Ori standing over a bowl of youth drawn from her daughter's tears, Duma as a child screaming into the dark as invisible fists rained down on his mother. And then Naya saw herself, old and withered, combing her hair with the same cursed comb, a child watching from the doorway, wide-eyed, history threatening to repeat itself, and she staggered back, gasping. But the guardian closed its fist over the comb and stepped aside without a word, allowing them to pass. And as they crossed through the living arch, the air grew colder, heavier, as if dipped in sorrow, and they entered a realm unlike the world behind them, a land of crimson grass, skyless and echoing with distant weeping, where trees floated above the ground and rivers flowed upward like reversed grief. And here the dead whispered without mouths, calling out names not yet spoken, and the ground itself shifted beneath them like a living memory unwilling to be walked upon without cost. The moment Naya and Duma stepped beyond the living arch, it sealed behind them with a sound like 1,000 sighs exhaled in unison, and the world that now surrounded them no longer obeyed the logic of earth or sky. It was a realm suspended in grief and memory, where the land pulsed beneath their feet like the flesh of something alive, where rivers slithered through the air like silver serpents, and the trees hovered rootless, spinning slowly with leaves that wept black ink instead of falling, and above them, instead of a sky, was a dome of rippling darkness filled with ghostly eyes watching without blinking. And from the horizon, a thin mist rolled in, whispering Naya's name in dozens of voices, some familiar, like her mother's fevered warnings and her grandmother's lullabies, and others foreign, like unborn children who might never be, their breath riding the wind like forgotten futures. Naya clutched her chest as the air thickened, and the comb's absence left a cold void near her heart, as if its curse had not vanished but merely spread into the soil around her. And Duma stumbled beside her, his steps uneven, his eyes flickering, with panic as he clutched his head, whispering something too low for her to hear. And suddenly he dropped to his knees with a groan, clawing at his face as shadow seeped from his eyes, like ink bleeding through cloth. And Naya cried out, reaching for him. But the moment her fingers touched his shoulder, a vision surged through her like lightning through bone. She saw Duma standing in a circle of fire, his arms covered in scars shaped like tribal glyphs, screaming up at the sky as the horned shadow within him split through his skin, a beast, made of smoke and sorrow, its mouthless face now opening in a terrible, endless scream that shattered the air around it. And she saw herself watching, powerless, as the creature turned its hollow gaze toward her and whispered, "Return what was stolen, or feed the curse forever." And then she was back, kneeling beside him as he wept silently, his hands shaking, his voice finally loud enough to understand as he muttered, "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to become him." Over and over, and Naya's heart cracked open with a mixture of rage and pity. For now she understood what followed him. It was not just his father's sins, but a spirit born of all the women broken by his bloodline, a darkness fed by each scream, each bruise, each soul silenced. And now it had grown fat and ancient, anchoring itself in him like a parasite dressed in inherited pain. Just then, a figure emerged from the mist, an old woman whose eyes had no whites, only swirling galaxies, her body covered in cowrie shells that chimed with every step, her voice low and echoing as she said, "You seek the priestess of the sacred hills, but first the land must taste your truth." And before Naya could answer, the ground beneath them split open like a cracked gourd, and they fell through darkness into a chamber of mirrors, where each reflection showed not the present, but alternate versions of their lives. Naya as the next wielder of the comb, youthful and cruel. Duma as a father to a daughter whose eyes bore bruises of prophecy. Mama Ori kneeling in chains before a tribunal of spirits with scorched wings. And as they floated between these visions, their bodies untouched by gravity but held firm by judgment, the old woman's voice echoed again, "You cannot cleanse what you will not face. Look, child of Ori, look and decide what your blood shall become." As Naya and Duma drifted through the mirror chamber suspended in weightless judgment, time unraveled into strands of possibility, and each glass surface reflected not just echoes of their pasts, or hints of what could be, but twisted versions, born from the deepest wounds of their bloodlines. Naya saw herself dressed in the red cloth of high priestesses, her hands stained with the youth of her nieces, combing her hair with the sacred relic under the blood moon as her voice chanted songs older than language. A crowd of bound girls kneeling before her, their eyes wide with fear and reverence, and she felt the horror of that image cling to her skin like ash. But even more terrifying was the pleasure in her reflection's smile, the power blooming in her limbs like wildfire. Another mirror showed her fleeing with Duma as they raised a child together, a daughter with her eyes and his shadow, who at 12 stood quietly while Duma's rage poured down like rain. And Naya turned away from that vision with a cry, only to face another, herself dying young, withered and alone in the forest. The comb untouched beside her as roots wrapped around her body in a silent burial, forgotten by history but free from the curse. And in each of these versions the comb remained central, not merely an object but a character, a vessel of fate that fed on choice and consequence. And Duma, floating beside her, was muttering again, his face flickering through dozens of ages, young and guiltless, middle-aged and monstrous, old and broken, each version marked by the same darkness in his eyes, a spiritual sickness that no river could wash clean, and the mirrors around him reflected scenes even he dared not face. His mother's broken body, beneath a blood-soaked mat, his own fists clenched and trembling over another woman's sobbing form, his daughter running into a burning hut to escape, his shadow, and in one mirror, the horned beast stepped fully into the world, using his body like a mask, its eyes weeping molten hatred, its claws ripping open the very fabric of the world. And Naya saw fire consume her village, the river boiling, with the screams of unborn children, the totem in the forest shattered and bleeding, and the ancestors retreating into silence. Defeated, and suddenly the chamber went dark, the mirrors cracking one by one as a voice not of this realm boomed through the air, low and layered, saying, "Choose, daughter of Ori, choose your curse. Wield it or break it. But know that either path will cost blood." And the chamber splintered, fragments of broken glass dissolving into dust, and they landed hard on a cold, white plain surrounded by stones shaped like kneeling women, their heads bowed, their faces weeping black tears carved by time, and in the center stood a great hut of woven bones and silk, its door alive, breathing faintly, opening and closing like a mouth waiting to speak. And Duma staggered to his feet, broken by what he'd seen, his voice hollow as he asked Naya, "Will you still walk with me?" And she looked at him, truly looked, not as a lover, not as a victim, but as a mirror, and saw not just the beast he might become, but the man who could try to undo it. And she whispered, "Only if you let the shadows fall off your back," and turned toward the living hut, knowing that what waited inside was not just the priestess of the sacred hills, but the final gate between her and the truth of the Combs' creation. The moment history chose silence over justice, and the curse was born not of power, but of betrayal sealed in sacred hands. The living hut stood like a heart torn from time, its walls stitched from the ribs of forgotten matriarchs and layered with silken webs, spun by spirit spiders that fed only on regret, its doorway quivering with breath that smelled of river clay and ancient rot. And as Naya stepped closer, the bone-woven structure began to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, a low thudding that echoed across the white plain and made the weeping statues tremble with soundless sorrow. And behind her Duma approached slowly, his footsteps hesitant as if the ground itself questioned his right to walk upon it. And when Naya placed her hand upon the threshold, the door did not open, it dissolved, peeling away like wet bark to reveal a chamber of flickering darkness, lit only by floating flames that hovered mid-air like memories refusing to fade. And the moment they crossed into the hut, time folded inward and the world behind them vanished entirely, replaced by a deep, living silence broken only by the slow drip of water from unseen heights, and the rustle of bones rearranging themselves beneath their feet. And there in the center of the hut, seated atop a throne of hair and thorned vines, was the priestess of the sacred hills, a being of impossible age and layered identities, her body shifting with each blink, one moment a child with milky eyes, the next a hunched elder with rivers carved into her skin, the next a woman made entirely of smoke and sorrow. And she did not speak at first, only watched Naya with a stare that pierced bone, and then finally her voice arrived not through her mouth, but inside their minds, 1,000 voices speaking as one, saying, "You carry the sin of inheritance and the fire of defiance. Tell me, Naya of Ori, why have you come to awaken what sleeps?" And Naya, though trembling, stepped forward and spoke from the marrow of her soul, her voice steady and soft, to end the curse, or carry it with new eyes. The priestess rose slowly, her many forms folding into one, a tall woman with skin like river clay, eyes glowing gold, and a comb carved from bone tucked into her hair, and she stepped forward, circling Naya as she began to chant in a language that was neither spoken nor remembered, a language older than gods, and the air began to change, thickening with memory, bending around them as visions poured from the walls. Mama Ori as a young woman, standing before 3 tribal elders, weeping, holding her infant son, begging for mercy after her husband vanished with her sister, the elders laughing coldly, calling her cursed, denying her place among them. The comb presented to her in secret by a faceless woman in the forest who said, "With this, take back your years, they owe you that much." And the vision shifted to Mama Ori combing her hair with it, under the river moon, her youth returning, her baby crying behind her. And Naya cried as she saw the roots of the curse, how it was born not from greed, but despair, vengeance twisted into ritual, and how each daughter who used the comb afterward inherited not power, but grief dressed as beauty. And the priestess placed a hand on Naya's chest and whispered, "You have seen the seed. Now choose what it becomes. Destroy the comb and bury your bloodline's magic, or sanctify it and wear its hunger as your burden forever." But before Naya could answer, the hut screamed, its walls vibrating violently as shadows spilled inward, and from the doorway stepped the horned beast cloaked in Duma's shape, its mouthless face grinning wide with unseen teeth. And the priestess turned sharply, her eyes burning brighter, saying, "The beast of silence comes. He has fed too long on pain unspoken." Duma dropped to his knees, shaking, as the shadow began to pour from his back like thick smoke, and the comb, the true one, now hovering midair, began to tremble between the 2 fates waiting to claim it, leaving only Naya, the priestess, and Duma locked in a silence that howled louder than war drums. The beast moved without footsteps, gliding across the floor like smoke that had remembered how to wear flesh, its face still mouthless but twisted into the shape of an unseen grin. And as it drew closer, Naya felt the comb's pull intensify, the relic floating mid-air now spinning slowly, glowing with alternating pulses of red and gold, as if the ancestral fire within it were unsure whether to awaken or die. And the priestess stepped in front of Naya, her body lengthening into a towering form cloaked in stardust and ash, arms outstretched as she whispered an incantation so deep it caused the bones in the hut to tremble and twist into protective sigils. But the beast only laughed, not with sound but with vibration, a low, sickening hum that cracked mirrors inside the mind, and from Duma's body spilled memories like oil, showing Naya every moment of his inherited pain, his father's violence like a curse passed down through blood and silence, his mother broken by shame and secrecy, and Duma himself trying to love but always failing, always twisting his affection into control, always hiding the beast that whispered, "She owes you everything," until now that beast had grown too large for the shadows, and as the priestess held it back with chants made of time and truth, Naya knew what must happen. This moment was not just about the comb or the curse, but about choice, the turning of fate's wheel by a hand that refused to tremble. She stepped forward, placing her hand upon the comb, and instantly, visions tore through her soul, a future where she destroyed it, and her bloodline faded into ordinariness, safe but powerless. Another where she kept it, bore its burden, and stood as both guardian and prison for the relic, aging slowly, visited by girls seeking to reclaim what was never stolen from them but denied. And then a third, a path unformed, where the comb was neither destroyed nor hoarded but purified through pain, where she and Duma could sever the beast with fire drawn not from vengeance, but confession. And as she opened her mouth to choose, Duma screamed, a deep, tearing sound that was not for himself but for every woman he had failed. and the beast shrieked, its smoky form unraveling in waves as the priestess seized the moment, casting a spear of ancestral fire from her palm into its chest, and it began to rupture from within, splitting into pieces made of memory and shadow. And Naya reached toward the comb, whispering, "Let this be the last girl you curse." And as her fingers touched it, the relic burst into light, neither burning nor cold, but filled with a warmth that smelled of river jasmine and tasted like breath after morning. And the hut exploded in silence, no sound, just wind and light and dust, as if the world itself exhaled relief. And when it cleared, they were outside again, on the white plain, the sky slowly rebuilding, the comb now resting quietly in Naya's hand, warm and still, changed, cleansed not of its power, but of its thirst. The white plain returned slowly, as if summoned from beneath the ashes of what had just been destroyed, and for a long, aching moment, all was still. No wind, no sound, no movement, only the whispering silence of a world that had held its breath for too long. And in the center stood Naya, trembling yet unbroken, the newly transfigured comb cradled in both hands like a newborn born of grief and fire, its glow now dimmed to a steady warmth, its sharp hum replaced by a heartbeat that echoed her own. And across from her, Duma lay sprawled in the dirt, face down, his body still shaking from the soul-deep purge that had nearly split him in two. And though the horned beast had been severed from his spirit, its residue lingered in his skin like the scent of rain on scorched land, a reminder that darkness once lived there, fed there, and may still return if left unspoken again. Naya stepped toward him slowly, the plain crunching beneath her feet, and knelt beside him without a word, her eyes watching not his wounds but his posture, how he held himself now, different, smaller, humbled not just by fear but by something harder to earn, understanding. And when he finally lifted his face, his eyes were rimmed with salt and silence, and he whispered her name like a plea without expectation, and she did not answer immediately, for words were too thin to hold what now passed between them. And instead she placed the comb upon the earth between them, drawing a small circle around it with her finger, and within that circle she whispered the names of her mother, her mother's mother, and the daughters yet unborn who would come after, binding the relic not to vanity or vengeance but to memory, a vow that it would never again feed on youth without truth, never again take more than it returned. And the ground accepted the offering, humming faintly, the comb sinking slightly into the soil as if becoming part of the land's rhythm. And from the distance, the priestess appeared once more, not within the hut, but walking barefoot across the plain, her eyes no longer burning with judgment, but calm, and she spoke aloud. For the first time, her voice no longer fractured but singular and full, saying, "It is done." But the echo remains. The beast is severed, but its name still sleeps in the bones of men. What will you do with that? And Naya stood slowly, her shoulders square, her face lined not with age but with revelation. And she said, "We cannot kill what we do not teach. To die, I will carry the name, not as a curse but as a warning and a prayer." The priestess nodded, her form beginning to fade into drifting petals of ash and light, her final words cast into the wind like seeds. "Then walk, daughter of Ori. Walk until the daughters of your daughters need not run." And with that, the sky above them cracked open, not with thunder, but with sunlight the first Naya had seen since entering Ogbun, and it poured over the plain like forgiveness made gold. And the statues that once wept now lifted their faces to the light, no longer crying, but singing low songs of release. And Duma, still silent, placed his hand beside the comb in the earth, not to claim it, but to share its weight. And together they stood, not cleansed, but seen. And though the path back into the world shimmered before them with uncertainty, it was theirs now earned through pain, vision, and the refusal to remain silent. The sun that rose above the white plain was not the sun of the living world, it was the eye of Anu, the first ancestor, whose light revealed not just shapes and shadows, but truths buried deep in the marrow of things forgotten. And as its golden gaze swept across the field where Naya and Duma stood, it stirred the very bones of the statues around them, causing the once silent stone women to shift, their chests rising as if breathing for the first time in centuries, and their voices rose in a language so old it predated names, a chorus of mourning turned into praise, a song of release for daughters who had been voiceless too long. And the ground beneath the sacred comb trembled as if agreeing, as if bearing witness to its rebirth. As more than a cursed object, it was now a relic of reckoning, bound not to hunger but to memory and vow. And yet even as the light bathed them, and the ancestral wind softened, Naya felt a stirring within her bones, a restlessness that did not come from fear, but from the deep echo of unfinished journeys. For though the beast was cast out and the comb redeemed, the world beyond this realm remained unchanged, and there were still men who bore monsters behind their eyes, still daughters brushing their hair in secret, still mothers who grew old in silence while pretending they were whole. And she knew then that her task was not to carry the comb as a relic, but to carry its story, to walk the villages and sacred lands and whisper into the ears of women and men alike the truth of what had been done, of how power taken in pain must be returned in healing or it would grow teeth and devour again. And so when the plain finally began to shift its edges folding into light, the path home reappearing, like a scar reopened, she did not hesitate, and neither did Duma, though his walk was slower now, each step a quiet apology, not spoken but carved into the earth by the way he carried his shadow. And they walked through a veil of golden mist that clung to their skin like breath, emerging not into their village, but into a new land, lush and thick with life, where the trees leaned in to listen, and the river sang in a voice that carried secrets. And they followed a path laid not in stone or dust, but in rhythm drumbeats rising in the distance, steady and low, calling them toward a gathering not yet formed, a place where stories were traded like salt and truth was brewed into fire. On their backs, the marks of the journey glowed faintly, Naya's spine traced with golden vines that pulsed when she spoke, and Duma's shoulders lined with faded chains that hummed when he remembered. And as they walked, animals watched without fear. The air smelled of rain long before it fell, and the comb, now hidden in Naya's wrap, remained quiet but present, not demanding, not cursing, only listening. And the land ahead shimmered with possibilities, new trials, new faces, new shadows rising, but she was no longer the girl who fled, no longer the orphan of Ori, but the keeper of the untold. And as she reached the edge of a small village where drums waited to announce her arrival, she whispered to the wind, "We begin again," but this time with eyes wide open, beneath the whispering canopy of Ojiela, where the branches of the Iroko trees braided themselves into veils of memory, and the wind smelled of yam ash, camwood, and ancestral oil. Naya and Duma stepped into the outer ring of the forgotten village of Ndimbu, a place that did not exist on any map drawn by hands that had forgotten how to dream. For this was a village that once disappeared from history when the last daughter to speak truth was buried alive under a tree that bled sap the color of sorrow. And now, centuries later, as Naya's foot touched its sacred soil, the village stirred from its slumber with a tremble that shook the spiders from their nests and made the lizards pray in stillness. And though the homes of Ndimbu were swallowed by vines and the drums long silenced by shame, the very air recognized her, curling around her skin with the weight of recognition. And in that moment, the comb within her wrapper throbbed once more, not with hunger or darkness, but with urgency, as if the earth beneath them begged to be heard before it was forgotten again. And so they ventured in slowly, Duma silent beside her, his eyes darting at every carved totem, every feathered shrine leaning sideways as if the past itself had collapsed under its own grief. And Naya's breath caught when she saw the first sign, the remnants of a hair-plaiting stool, buried in moss, carved with the image of a woman surrounded by birds with broken wings. And beside it, a broken gourd filled with beads worn down to the smoothness of river stones. And she remembered her grandmother's voice once telling her that Ndimbu was the village where the last combs were made from the bones of women who died for saying no. And as she reached down to lift a single bead from the earth, the sky above her shimmered like heat rising from a clay pot. And from the center of the village emerged a figure neither living nor dead, cloaked in orange dust, skin like cracked leather, eyes the color of charcoal soaked in palm wine. And when he spoke, the ground itself flinched, for he was the keeper of Ndimbu, the last man permitted to speak in a village silenced by curses. And he told them without welcome that this was the place where the curse of the comb began, not in vengeance, but in desperation. When a woman named Ijeoma, betrayed by her lover, and beaten until her voice lived only in her daughter's heartbeat, used her dying breath to weave a comb from her own ribs, cursing it so that no man who touched her blood would ever steal her future again. And thus the comb had passed through generations, not as an heirloom but as a cry, a scream turned to bone, sharpened by silence. And Naya stood before the keeper with her hands trembling, for in her chest echoed not just her grandmother's voice but that of Ijeoma, calling her by name, beckoning her into the shrine of the morning womb, a place sealed by salt and sorrow where only the cursed may enter. And she entered alone, the darkness folding over her like a mother's embrace, the walls alive with whispers too raw for the ears of men. And inside she found a circle of 13 combs, floating in the air, each carved from a different agony, one from betrayal, one from childbirth, one from exile, one from the screams of girls sold for cows. And they pulsed around her, like stars orbiting a dying sun. And the combs she carried rose from her wrapper, drawn to them, and together they began to spin, faster and faster, the room shaking with the force of stories buried too long. And then came the vision. Naya saw herself at 13, combing her hair in her mother's lap, the older woman's eyes distant, her hands trembling, whispering a lullaby with no tune. And now she understood the sadness behind it, the weight she had never named, the look her mother gave her as if to apologize for a future she could not stop. And Naya screamed not in fear but in fury, and with that cry, the combs stopped. The room cracked open, and from the earth rose the spirit of Ijeoma herself, towering and flame-eyed, her voice a cascade of sorrow and steel, telling Naya that the curse could only be broken, not by cleansing the comb, but by unweaving the silence passed from mother to daughter, by speaking aloud what had never been spoken. And so Naya fell to her knees and recited every pain in her bloodline, every bruise hidden by laughter, every tear swallowed by duty, every shame buried by tradition. And as her voice rose, the shrine burned brighter, the walls splitting to reveal the bones of women once hidden. And with each word, one comb turned to ash, until only hers remained, glowing softly, changed forever. And when she emerged, her hair unbound and eyes rimmed with ash, the keeper knelt before her and whispered, "Ndimbu remembers." And the vines on the village walls recoiled, revealing the names of women once erased, now carved into stone. And Duma stepped forward and offered her his voice, not to lead, but to follow, saying, "Then teach me how to hear." And the wind shifted, carrying their promise into the trees as the sun passed overhead. And for the first time in centuries, Ndimbu exhaled. In the blue hush of dawn where silence wrapped the world like a burial cloth, and every leaf held its breath beneath the trembling sky, Naya and Duma departed from the sacred ruins of Ndimbu, their feet tracing the path of those forgotten. The warm glow of the final comb secured in Naya's satchel now pulsing with a gentler light, not demanding nor mourning, but guiding as if it had found within her the final thread of story it had sought across centuries. And with every step they took, the forest shifted around them, not in menace, but in slow reverence, as though recognizing that something older than time was moving through it again. And after 2 days of walking through thick, tangled lands where even the monkeys dared not speak, and the winds carried the scent of long-lost rituals, they reached a river that ran red not with blood, but with the flower-dyed tears of a sacred grove upstream, where the spirits of wronged women had gathered for generations to cleanse their pain into beauty. And it was there, at the bend of that sorrowful river, that they encountered the caravan of masked walkers, tall, robed figures who traveled between cursed lands collecting the unspoken, the unseen, the unnamed, their faces hidden by masks carved from baobab bark and elephant bone, each mask sketched with the history of a forgotten woman. Each step they took marked by bells that made no sound unless they passed someone carrying guilt. And though Naya's footsteps made no bell stir, Duma's presence triggered a faint echo, a weeping chime that seemed to come not from him, but from his shadow. And the tallest walker, draped in feathers the color of fire, turned toward him and whispered through the slits of his mask, "Have you made offering to the silence yet?" And Duma, eyes lowered, replied, "I have not, but I carry the weight." And the masked walkers parted, letting them pass only after placing in Naya's hand a stone carved into the shape of a tear, instructing her to bury it where her mother first taught her to lie, for only then would the earth begin to speak truth again. And so they journeyed on, crossing wide salt flats that cracked beneath their steps like old bones, entering a land called Obuka, a place where truth was hunted like game and hung from trees as warnings. And there, beneath the gaze of vultures with human eyes, they arrived at a compound surrounded by skulls stacked into fences, where the people no longer spoke with their mouths, but only with hand signs and drums, for their voices had been stolen in the age of the iron. Marriage, when men who beat their wives were declared more complete by the gods of fire. And Naya knew this place, for it was here her grandmother once fled from after sealing her husband into the comb's curse. And though her grandmother had walked away with youth stolen from her own daughters, her soul had never crossed back to this village. And now Naya returned not as kin, but as reckoning, and the drums stopped when she entered, the children peeking from behind broken calabashes. And an old woman with silver coils in her hair stepped forward and drew in the dust a circle, marking it with ash from her own cooking pot, and said in the voice of the wind, "You carry the comb of bones, you must dance the undoing." And Naya, though afraid, stepped into the circle with bare feet and whispered, "Then teach me the rhythm." And so began the most ancient of rituals, the dance of undoing, where each movement unstitched a memory. Each footfall broke a silence, and as Naya danced, the sky above began to tear at the edges like soaked cloth, revealing flickers of the world before the cursed visions of women laughing, braiding hair in sunlight, of daughters running freely, without shame, of men who held power without fear. And with each turn of her body, the rhythm deepened, the ground began to hum, and Duma, sitting just beyond the circle, wept quietly, For in her movements he saw the woman he had nearly destroyed. The woman he had once tried to bend with violence now becoming flame. And then the earth beneath her feet cracked, and from it rose a spirit unlike any other, shaped like a woman, with 7 faces and no mouth. And she pressed her many palms to Naya's shoulders and whispered directly into her bones. You are the first to dance willingly, you are the first to name the wound. And as the final beat sounded, Naya collapsed into the arms of the elder woman, her body slick with ash and truth. And the villagers dropped to their knees, the curse that had muted them lifting like morning mist. And for the first time in over 100 years, the village sang not in joy, but in grief-laced release. And their voices rose high into the canopy, breaking even the birds from silence. And the skulls around the compound crumbled to dust, the fences fell, and the compound itself seemed to breathe, as if finally released from the weight of its own shame. And later that night, by the fire, Naya sat with Duma, both of them cloaked, in silence too holy to disturb. And the comb now marked with the dust of truth rested between them, neither cursed nor holy, but simply honest. And as the stars blinked above in the endless fabric of the sky, the masked walkers reappeared at the edge of the trees and bowed their heads once, before vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind a final warning carved into the bark of a nearby tree. When the last daughter sings without fear, the roots will rise to listen. And with that, Naya knew their journey was not over, only deeper. For the comb had more stories to reveal, more truths to carve into the world. And ahead of them, somewhere across the far desert, lay the place where the curse had touched the gods themselves, and it was there they must go next. Beneath a sky stretched tight with heat and humming with spirits too ancient to name, Naya and Duma left behind the village once silenced by shame, carrying with them the ash-marked comb that now pulsed not with hunger, not with malevolence, but with something stranger, something deeper, an awareness that had begun to breathe through its carved teeth, as though the stories inside it were waking, not just as memory but as intent. And their journey led them past the salt plains of Iboko, where the wind howled in the voices of the unborn, and into the ochre-tinted desert known as Ahanzuzu, the dunes of ivory silence, a sacred wasteland said to exist between this world and the next, where direction died, time stumbled, and even shadows forgot to follow. And as their sandals scraped across cracked earth that bled powdery white dust, Naya's thoughts began to unravel, memories drifting between the folds of her mind like smoke curling through a shrine. Memories not her own but belonging to her grandmother, her great-grandmother, to Ijeoma herself, their voices threading through her veins until her heartbeat sounded like 100 ancestral drums, thundering beneath her ribs. And at night, when the sky blackened into obsidian, and the stars arranged themselves into symbols no man had named in 1,000 years, she dreamed of women standing in water up to their necks, braiding each other's hair with fingers made of flame and bone, each plait sealing a promise, each twist anchoring a truth. And always, always in the center of those dreams hovered the comb, ancient and trembling, the carved face of Ijeoma etched deeper now, her eyes open wider, her mouth no longer sealed, her jaw stretching with effort as though she longed to speak. And when Naya awoke one night and looked into the comb under moonlight, she saw not her reflection but a storm of faces, women she could not name but somehow knew, their mouths moving silently, each face flickering like fire in the wind. And the next morning, the desert offered them its first omen, a tree growing from sand, its bark made of braided hair, its leaves small silver mirrors that reflected not the sky above but the faces of those who had once suffered in silence. And Duma, who had walked beside her with steady remorse and a quiet hunger for redemption, fell to his knees before the tree. For in one of its mirrored leaves he saw the woman he had once hurt, the woman whose name he had buried with shame. And the tree began to hum, its branches rattling like anklets in a funeral dance. And Naya touched its trunk and whispered the names of every woman in her family, beginning with her mother, ending with Igioma, and when she was done, the ground beneath the tree cracked open and revealed a staircase carved into stone, each step covered in woven cloth soaked in old blood and dried tears. And without hesitation, they descended into the heart of the mountain that now rose behind them, a jagged, bone-white colossus that seemed to have grown overnight, its summit wrapped in mist that glowed faintly blue. And as they went deeper, the air thickened with memory, the walls breathing, pulsing, murmuring words in no known tongue but which Naya understood anyway, for they were the sounds of women speaking truth in the dark, unrecorded, unpraised, unremembered. And at the base of the mountain's heart, they found a chamber lit by a single stone flame hovering midair, and around it stood statues of women, life-sized and lifeless, each one caught in mid-motion, one shielding her child, one raising a fist, one covering a wound, one weeping into her palms, one combing her own hair with defiant sand. In the center lay a pool of water still as glass, and floating above it, suspended by strands of invisible thread, was the original comb, the mother comb, carved not from bone, but from something older, something alive, perhaps a god's tooth or a fallen star. And as Naya stepped forward, her own comb began to vibrate violently, leaping from her hands to hover beside the mother comb, and the two spiraled around each other like suns in orbit. And from the pool below them rose a column of smoke shaped like Igioma, now full-formed, her voice finally audible as she spoke in words layered with centuries of pain and prophecy. "This is where the gods were broken," she said. "This is where I forged the first comb with the help of the earth itself, and in it I buried not just my grief, but the grief of every daughter who would ever live in fear of a raised hand, a silenced mouth, an erased name, and for every woman who wore her bruises beneath laughter. I promised justice, not through bloodshed, but through remembrance. For to remember is to resurrect, and to resurrect is to reclaim." And her eyes met Naya's then, and she continued, "But even I could not foresee the greed of my own bloodline, the way the curse would be used not to protect, but to steal youth, to buy time, to evade truth. And now the comb is heavy with misuse. It can no longer be carried into the next world, unless cleansed by a truth too terrible to utter." And Naya asked, her voice barely a breath, "What truth?" And the spirit replied, "That love and violence once wore the same face in your bloodline, that salvation and suffering once slept in the same bed." And at that moment, Duma stepped forward, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as a man offering his whole, unflinching truth. And he said, "I struck the woman I loved, and in doing so, I struck every woman who came before her." And the statues around them cracked, one by one, each fracture releasing a sigh into the chamber. And the mother comb pulsed once more and descended toward Naya's hands. And as she touched it, visions overwhelmed her, visions of her grandmother laughing with her first love, before the beatings began, of her mother holding her as a baby while hiding scars beneath her wrapper, of Igioma lying beneath the stars with a man who promised to protect her and later chained her voice to silence. And Naya screamed, not in horror, but in fury, in grief, in the kind of pain that cleanses. And the chamber shuddered, and the comb shattered into dust that filled the air with ancestral breath. And that dust did not fall, but entered Naya's skin, her eyes, her mouth, her hair. And when it settled, she stood taller, brighter, changed. and from her back unfurled spectral wings braided from strands of every woman's hair that had touched the comb, and the chamber began to rise, the mountain splitting open to let in light, and the statues turned to flesh and walked out with her, women reborn from memory, their voices harmonizing into a song that shook the desert, a song that reached even into the lands where silence still ruled. And as Naya emerged from the mountain, glowing with the power of every truth ever silenced, the people of distant villages began to stir in their sleep, their dreams echoing with her name. And the masked walkers returned one last time, placing their masks at her feet and bowing low. And Duma stood behind her, not as protector, not as partner, but as witness, and in that moment, Naya raised the final comb, now reborn, no longer cursed but consecrated, and broke it in half, letting its fragments fall into the earth, where they turned to seeds and sprouted into comb trees whose branches would one day comb the sky itself. And with that, the curse unraveled, not with thunder, not with fire, but with the sound of women finally being believed. And so it was that beneath a thunderless sky swollen with the breath of ancestors newly remembered, Naya emerged from the mountain of chained echoes as something no longer entirely human, yet not fully divine, her feet dusted with the sacred ash of unraveled curses, her hair catching the desert wind like a shroud spun from time itself, her eyes glinting with the light of every soul that had whispered their pain into the comb's cruel teeth. And behind her came the awakened statues of the chamber, no longer stone but women wrapped in breath and memory, each of them stepping into a world that had forgotten their names only to be sung again in the silence of drums beating from the earth's own chest. And as they descended the fractured ridges of the mountain, a golden rain fell from a sky that had held back its tears for too many centuries, each droplet warm and heavy with blessing, each drop awakening seeds of truth long buried under the fear of remembering. And far across the ivory dunes, villages that had once chained their women to silence began to pulse with unease. Goats bleated without cause, children pointed to shadows that no longer ran away, and elders whispered of the return of Igema's flame, not as curse this time, but as reckoning. And when Naya reached the base of the mountain where the sacred tree of mirrors still hummed with silver truths, she placed the remaining shard of the comb, the one fragment she had not let fall into soil, into the hollow of its roots. And immediately the ground trembled, not in violence, but as if the land itself was shifting to make room for the return of something holy. And then the wind spoke, not in howls but in soft consonants. Syllables formed from every story denied, every bruise hidden beneath laughter, every woman who had ever whispered no into the void and received silence in reply. And those syllables gathered into language, and that language into prophecy, and the prophecy into song. And as the song rose, so did Naya's voice, not loud, not forced, but steady, speaking words that had waited generations to be heard. Let this land no longer eat its daughters. And with those words, the sky split, not with lightning but with ancestral flame, and spirits poured forth in quiet fury. Women from every era, some in iron collars, others with royal beads, some barefoot and ragged, others wrapped in gold-threaded cloth, each one rising into the wind with faces luminous and eyes hollowed by history. And they circled Naya like a halo of fire, whispering their names as if to stitch themselves back into the world. Adama, Nkechi, Zola, Aminata, Tariro, Lindu, Efua, Salima, Moremi, Binta, and as each name was spoken, the trees in distant villages bent low, the rivers rippled upstream, the stars rearranged themselves into the shape of a great comb spread across the heavens. And then the earth began to open, not to swallow but to reveal. revealing relics buried in haste diaries, braids, bones, broken bangles, whispered prayers trapped in pots sealed with wax, each one rising as if called by Naya's heartbeat now woven with the rhythm of justice. And somewhere behind her, Duma watched, tears soaking his face not from guilt alone but from the brutal recognition that while redemption was not his to claim, witnessing could be a form of penance, and he would carry the story as flame and burden, as reminder and offering. And as Naya turned to him, their eyes met not as lovers or saviors, but as the two ends of a broken circle finally closing. And he bowed not low, not theatrically, but enough to say, "I see now," and Naya nodded, then stepped toward the pool that had once held the mother comb, which now shimmered with clear water where once there had been only memory, and she knelt, placed her hands inside, and from the ripples rose the final vision, Ijeoma in her last days, old and broken, staring into the fire and whispering to the comb, "Let no girl walk where I did." And Naya spoke aloud, "You were not the curse, Ijeoma, you were its vessel." And as those words echoed through the chamber, the very air sighed, and the final tether holding the comb's dark power snapped like thread pulled to tight. And at that moment, across the lands, every comb carved in its likeness cracked. Every mirror that had hidden bruises turned to glass that reflected truth. Every drum silent from fear began to beat without hands, and every mother who had taught her daughter to endure now taught her to speak, and every ghost tied to the comb was set free, not in flame, but in wind. And the sky pulsed with a golden aurora that reached even to the forgotten edges of the world, where women too weary to hope lifted their heads and wept, not from pain, but from the knowing that something old had ended, and something older had begun again. And as the sun rose over the shattered mountain now turned to sacred grove, Naya stood tall, her wings of braided memory folding gently behind her, and she said, not to the world, but to time itself, "We are not waiting anymore." And the earth answered, not with thunder, but with blossoms blooming across graves, with silence breaking in courtrooms, with daughters dancing barefoot in fields their mothers once wept in, and the curse, now shattered, now transfigured, did not vanish, it changed form, becoming a memory woven into stories told beside fires, into lullabies sung in defiance, into combs carved not to control, but to honor. And those combs were passed down, not with warnings, but with blessings. And when Naya finally left the sacred place, walking beyond the desert, beyond the fear, beyond the legacy of stolen youth, she did not vanish into legend, she became it, her name braided into oral histories carried on the tongues of griots, and in the dreams of unborn girls who would someday rise without apology. And though her face was never carved into stone, it lived in water, in tree bark, in wind, and in the rhythm of women who had remembered how to rise. And that was the end of the curse, not with vengeance, not with death, but with truth, spoken aloud, witnessed, and finally believed.